there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by 3 self-certified TEFLologists. Okay, to start this episode's TEFL news, I'd like to ask both of you a question. Any ideas roughly how many words there are in the English language?
About 800.
Something like that, a little more.
There was something recently I heard comparing it to other languages. Maybe Russian has more.
Okay.
But I can't be sure. 300,000.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to say, really, because
Yeah.
I think we talked about this before, how you count number of words in a language.
Yeah, yeah.
But just as a kind of rough figure, the OED has 250,000 entries.
Okay.
So
That's closer than you, Rob.
Yeah?
Yeah, you're
Well,
really close.
I mean, I've got a much smaller vocabulary, so...
And how many words would you say an intermediate English language student would need to kind of communicate effectively?
It's meant to be about 2,000, isn't it, for intermediate level?
I would have said more, actually. I would have said 5,000. But
I've heard 2,000 for intermediate level.
right, okay.
Yeah, I've heard a similar number.
From different word groups and
Yeah.
lemurs, that kind of thing.
Lemurs.
Lemurs.
Lemur is not in
Lemurs.
the top. Okay, yeah, that sounds right. So how would you feel about a language, an entire language, consisting of only 123 words?
I'd like to see poetry written in that language.
Okay.
Well, how would I feel? I don't know if I'd be able to convey how I feel in that language.
Right.
So that gives you your answer, maybe.
Okay, well, such a language exists.
Mm-hmm.
It has 123 words, about. It's called Toki Pona.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically the newest of the artificial made-up languages.
Isn't that a
Right.
Sigur Rós song?
Is it?
No,
It might be.
it's not. But it sounds like a Sigur Rós song.
When it says only 123 words, does that include word groups?
It doesn't include compounds, and that's how they express a lot of
okay.
things. Basically, they put words together. Yeah.
Mm.
So they have 5 words for colors, but then they put those together to create other words for colors.
Okay.
So
Oh, you do that in English. Reddy brown. What am I describing?
Oh, I thought you meant ready, as in like, are you ready? So basically, the idea behind this language, which was created by a woman called Sonja Lang, is that her idea was to tap into the idea that all language uses metaphor anyway, and that but you can still express everything you need to using just these 123 words, but you have to be a little bit more creative with how you use those words.
Right.
So this seems a lot like a pidgin language, where they're using literally what's around them at the time, and it's
It sounds to me more like basic English that we talked about a few episodes ago,
Right,
where
right.
it's like there's a limited number of words, but you have to engage in a lot of circumlocution and that kind of thing. Is circumlocution one of the...
You could probably make that. How would you make circumlocution out of
talk,
12,000?
describe meaning, talk around words, or something like that.
Yeah, which is probably what a lot of people would say instead of saying circumlocution.
Well, they should study more.
Yeah. So the idea is not only to... I think that part of the idea is that by forcing people who use this language to be creative with the language, it's also... There's almost like a spiritual aspect to it, where you reduce everything down to its simplicity. And as Sonja Lang, the person who created it, points out, sometimes people learn the language, they want to kind of push it and they want to say, oh, I want to say all these different things. And apparently there's even a split amongst users of Toki Pona. Some people say, like, you shouldn't try to express things that are too complicated.
Mm.
Part of using the language is just keeping things very basic.
Right.
So, for example, they have, it has only words for the number 1, the number 2, and then a word for many, for more than that.
Right. Isn't that one of those, like, myths about other languages that people have?
Could be.
Like, people, they said that about... I've heard that said about, like, Eskimo languages and Aborigine languages.
Yeah.
And it's always not true.
Right. Well, I mean, this woman created the language, so in a way it's true. However, apparently a lot of people would use the word luka, which means both hand and arm, if they want to say 5.
Right.
And they use another word, I'm not sure the meaning, but to mean 10. And then if you want to say more than that, you just say the word over and over again.
Right.
And people have to follow how many times you said 10.
But you say that you do that in English as well, don't you? You have like 1 to 10, and then everything else is kind of built on, I guess 11, 12, but then it's all kind of built on multiples, like 25, 35, 110, whatever.
Yeah. It's strange. Like they say if you want more than 10, or if you want 20, you say the word for 10 2 times. And if you want for 50, presumably you say it 5 times. But why not just say the word for 5 and then the word for...
Well, then you get into like Roman numerals.
Right.
So I have some questions. So she created this language.
Yep.
So it's kind of a synthetic language. What was her original purpose? And are there first language speakers of this language?
First language speakers, no. So the book that kind of described it fully only came out a couple of years ago.
So it was mainly created as a language experiment rather than out of a language, like a communicative need, which is like pigeons and creoles.
Yeah. No, it's a completely made up language, like an Esperanto.
Right.
But it seems like she seems kind of idealistic in terms of her ideas behind it. Again, this idea that keeping everything simple.
What's the virtue in that? What does she see as the virtue in keeping things simple?
That's a good question. I think maybe it ties, the slow life thing is very popular, and, living a simple life, fewer possessions.
I guess. But it seems to me that language is as complex as it is because it evolves to meet communicative needs. And it seems, I like the idea that English is so big in terms of its vocabulary because it's gone around kind of assimilating things from other languages, or people have innovated in it to suit all the different contexts it's gone into.
Are you saying that you can express more in English than in other languages?
Not necessarily, but I'm saying that language evolves in order to express the things it needs to express.
Yeah.
But there's no reason why this couldn't evolve.
Except it's not meant to, right?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. Is that I think it seems like that's kind of how people, maybe her and people who use the language feel about it, is they don't want it to evolve that much. They want to keep it very simple. So she said, one of her quotes, she said, if you can express yourself in a simple way, then you really understand what you're talking about, and that's good. If something is too complicated, that's bad. You're putting too much noise into the equation.
I disagree.
I disagree too.
Yeah, like, if you think about all the things people have to communicate about, like how would, for example, medical researchers use this language, Right. Because they've got very specific things they need to talk about.
Yeah. Another interesting thing about it was there's less ambiguity in terms of, not ambiguity, there's less hedging. There's very few or no politeness markers.
Okay.
So no matter who you're talking to, you maybe to your family member, close family member, you'd say, give me that bottle. And if it's to somebody in a much higher position, you might say, oh, if you wouldn't mind, could you please pass the bottle? But in this language, Toki Pona, you say the same thing to everybody, which is give me the bottle.
See, I like that idea. I like the idea that you can strip away certain things from a language, but still convey the meaning that you want. But I don't think vocabulary should be the thing that's removed.
Just grammar,
like,
right? Just
grammar, just politeness, hedging, that kind of language should be removed in favour of vocabulary. So you could have a vocabulary-rich language, but get rid of all the politeness and all that kind of thing.
Right. I kind of like the idea of the social levelling that would have, but at the same time, those nuances are where a lot of social life resides, aren't they?
Of course.
I mean, it's like you could take a song and just strip it down to sing it, to humming the tune, and say, well, that's, you've stripped it down to the basic stuff. But all the nuance and the complexity lies in the rest of it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the point is you can do that. You can strip a song down to its basics, and that's nice. But that's just one option.
Right.
Many.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why is it called Toki Pona? What does that mean exactly?
I guess Toki means talk or language, because I know Tok Pisin, the Papua New Guinean pidgin, Tok means word
Creole,
or language.
Yeah.
Sorry, Creole, yes.
Yeah.
And Pisin means pigeon, so it literally means pigeon language.
Right.
So Pona means good or simple. Basically, it's the same meaning. And as you say, Toki means language. So it does to create the 123 words for this language. She did take them from other languages, or versions of them from other languages.
Right. How did she make choices on what to include and what not to include in her dictionary, I guess? Does it have a dictionary? Or?
Yeah, there's a book basically listing the 123 words and their meaning, and there's a grammar, obviously, and all those kinds of things. There's a writing system, but it uses the Latin alphabet, as you would imagine. It has only 9 consonants and 5 vowels.
Right.
Okay.
So that limits the word choice, I guess, or the variation of word construction.
I wonder. Yeah. I don't know. 9 consonant sounds is quite a lot, and 5 vowel sounds is Japanese gets away with 5 vowel sounds.
Yeah.
So in terms of language teaching, I think basically what people who do use this language have kind of shown, though, is that they can have full discussions and they can communicate quite effectively using this language. Obviously, they do have to get creative about combining words, and there may be some miscommunication sometimes. The people who use it say that they find themselves using body language a lot more.
Right. That was the thing I was going to say. Do other things come in to compensate for the things that have been stripped away? Do you end up using more body language and more other kinds of cues, or more maybe intonation or stress or whatever?
Yeah. It seems like that does happen. But do you think instead of students having to learn that 2,000 words to get to an intermediate level, if it were possible just to learn a much limited range of number of words, but still be able to communicate effectively?
But not necessarily to be able to understand effectively, depending on who they're talking to.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I think it's a good demonstration in our learners can achieve a lot with a little. So this is a good demonstration of that.
Yeah.
So it'd be good to show learners that things can be achieved with very little vocabulary and language.
Yeah, I mean, it
And
depends.
then you add more.
Yeah,
and that is a
Teaching.
kind of communication skill that some people naturally have. Being creative in a second language to communicate things. And maybe one thing I was thinking is that maybe learning this language would be good practice for that. Because people say you can kind of learn it in 30 hours, in terms of just memorizing all those words and starting to think about ways of combining them. But if you could do that in this language, if you're aware of how combining words will help you, or creative ways of expressing things, maybe you could apply that to another language.
Perhaps we should make this a bonus episode, us learning just the highlights.
No, I think a 30-hour
30-hour long
culminating in a podcast,
conversation.
a regular TEFLology podcast entirely.
That'd be interesting.
Our listeners can come along with us on
Yes.
the journey. So just by way of, just to finish this off, and by way of contrast, have you heard of Ithkil?
No.
Which is another invented language, but this is the opposite.
So it's the most complicated language in the world.
It's the most complicated language in the world. So there's 58 phonemes that come into play, and there's basically a highly structured grammatical framework. But the guy who created it, his point was that you could express all human thought with all these words.
Yeah, I don't know.
Apparently, the guy who created it, John Quijada, sometimes it takes him 10 minutes or more to assemble a single word. So
I think, what's the point in being able to express all human thought if it takes you like 100 years to make a sentence?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Slow life.
Right. Circle back to slow life.
A sentence would take you an hour to make.
Yeah,
That's fine.
it's true.
Got the time.
Yeah.
It's fine. He probably doesn't have a job. This guy.
Actually, he doesn't.
Right. Yeah. So when was this Toki Pona? When did it come into existence? Is it a fairly recent?
It is, yeah. So she published it, just a rough draft of it on
Right.
the internet in 2001. But then the complete book, like I say, came out a couple of years ago.
Right.
How many speakers of it are there in the world?
That is a good question.
Yeah, I mean like first like native speakers. That's what.
I mean, how many actual, in general, people who can speak it?
Right.
Um,
That's what I meant.
okay.
Not first.
So, well, yeah, first language speaker. Oh no, okay,
No,
you can't be a
yeah,
first
yeah.
language because you can. Yeah, of course. Yeah,
I
you're
mean,
not born in.
Yeah.
Well, you could be, I guess. Maybe her daughter or son is born into that language.
Yeah, but you know what would happen is they'd just end up adding complexity to it.
Yeah, let's find out.
So as of November 2016, the Facebook page had over 2,600
Oh really?
members.
Oh wow.
How many of those can speak?
Yeah, I don't know. There's also an unofficial Facebook group, which has 210 members.
Right.
But that one's called Toki Pona Tasso,
What's Tasso?
only.
Okay.
So
right. So
these are the
they,
purists.
Yeah.
These are the Protestants.
Exactly.
In the Toki Pona
So they talk
Reformation.
on Facebook using the language.
I guess so, yeah.
All right, we should look at that.
Take a look.
Yeah.
Okay, that is this episode's TEFL News.
Today's TEFL culture is duoethnography. Have you guys heard of duoethnography? But I
Is
can
that
barely
when
say
you
it.
have an ethnography but two of them?
No, but it's close. You're on the right track.
But it's an ethnography created by two people. It's like a conversation,
Correct.
an academic conversation.
That's right. Yeah. So if you're familiar with ethnography, I'll just give you a bit of background. If you're familiar with ethnography, basically ethnography is going observing a culture and writing about a culture, and there are kind of different versions of it. It depends what you describe as a culture. So my PhD is in ethnography, but it's an ethnography of one university department, right? And in qualitative research, there was a thing called the crisis of representation, right? Which is where people started to think, how is it possible that I, as an observer, can authentically represent the voice of someone else that I'm observing, right? How do I know that I'm interpreting their ideas correctly? And there are various ways of getting around that, but one way of getting around it was to do autoethnography, which is basically writing about your own experiences, with the understanding that they're not generalizable, but they're no less generalizable than regular ethnography, I guess, in a sense.
So can I just ask, so what are some of the typical measurements of information or research within ethnography?
Well,
And
it's
autoethnography.
it's not measurements of information.
I mean, like how would you record information?
Well, you can do it in several ways. So you can have a research journal, for example, where you go and observe things or participate in things and keep notes over a long period of time.
Right.
That's one source. You can also conduct interviews with people, with various different informants, and there's different typologies of informants. And you can collect artifacts and photographs and all kinds of things. And the idea is you do triangulation, which means you use these different sources of information to point towards one conclusion. So autoethnography is one person writing about their experience and their life history. And duoethnography is two people juxtaposing their different life histories in order to provide different perspectives on a topic. So
it's a duo autoethnography.
kind of, but it's just called a duoethnography. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
And recently I published, I think this is correct, with Marek Kiczkowiak from TEFL Equity Advocates, the first duoethnography in applied linguistics.
So this is news as well.
It's kind of news.
TEFL News Extra.
Yeah. And so the way that you conduct a duoethnography is you engage in conversation in some way. You could engage with someone by speaking to them face to face and recording the conversation, or you could do it over text. We actually collected data over, a messaging, online kind of messaging service, and collected a big store of data. You then search through that data and code it by different themes.
Yeah.
And then you construct from that fictional kind of dialogues which represent those themes. You can't. The raw data itself is usually a bit messy.
Okay.
So you identify the themes and then construct a kind of dialogue.
Does it
from
have
that.
to be constructed as a fictional dialogue? Or can it be written up in different forms?
It can be written up in different forms. It's quite. It was only invented as a method in 2004. So it was invented by Richard Sawyer and Joe Norris, who are one's a professor of education, one's a professor of drama in education. And so they wrote the first one in 2004, and since then it's been sort of building and growing.
Why is it not enough to present just the raw conversation as the thing for analysis and the thing that you present?
So you can do that, and you should really keep the raw data there. So if people want, they can check it. So you can do that, but in terms of it being open and easy to read, basically,
It's like any data.
You just tidy it up.
Collect a bunch of data, and you make all of it available, but you also interpret it in certain ways.
Exactly, yeah. And another kind of important point of geoethnography is because it's presented in this dialogic format. It's very accessible for people who are not going to sit and read a regular academic paper. They can sit and just witness these two researchers in conversation about a particular phenomenon. And again, the idea isn't to find any kind of universal or generalizable truth. It's to get different perspectives on an issue.
I see.
And to kind of disrupt grand narratives. So if you've got a set of research which is saying one thing, then you can use geoethnography to kind of poke holes in it, I guess.
So could you, before you carry on, could you tell us a bit about your particular example that you were involved with?
Yeah, so what me and Marek were doing was a geoethnography on native speakerism, and in particular the complexity of personal experience. So within native speakerism, there's within native speakerism research, there are kind of two big theories, or two big ways of thinking about it. One is talking about discrimination against people who are considered to be non-native speaker teachers, and various other issues connected to that. And then the other one, more recently, Horton and Rivers, we interviewed Stephanie Horton about it. It's more about, it's kind of saying it's discrimination against anyone on the basis of their speakerhood, but focusing more on the issues for native speakers, so-called native speakers. And so what we did was we compared our life histories, him as, a Polish English language teacher, me as a British English language teacher, and we looked at how our different positioning geographically, in terms of our personal disposition and so on, influenced the ways in which we experienced native speakerism at different points in our careers, and showed how there are differences between our personal experiences and these grand narratives, some of which kind of contradict the grand narratives, in a sense.
So you have bigger comparison points between you, but I wonder if you could do a duo-ethnography with simply two teachers who are on the same program or have the same class.
I imagine you could. Well, this
like
was
a very micro kind of.
This was what I wanted to ask. What areas do you think duoethnography might be useful for research?
Yeah,
in
well,
the
I was just thinking. I taught a deaf learner English last year. But what I'm thinking now is there was also another teacher who took on that class and probably went through the same experiences as I did. So I'm wondering if that would be a good dialogue to have.
Right.
Yeah.
That's my idea.
Right. I think you can apply it to almost anything. My first thing I thought of is something I'm interested in and working on is program evaluation. So again, like Matt said, two people doing the same job. Discussing it, two people in a kind of management position discussing it, or somebody in a management position and somebody that is supervising, comparing their perspectives of that.
Right.
Could it be more than two people?
Yes, actually. So I said that the one that I was involved was the first, but there was actually one conducted by three people, I believe, studying like applied linguistics or English language programs. But they weren't really talking about English language education, so it doesn't count. But they called it a trio ethnography because there were three of them.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was done a couple of years ago.
You were leapfrogged.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there are certain areas where I think this probably wouldn't be useful. For example, I don't know how useful it would be in SLA. I read an autoethnography in SLA recently, and it was interesting to read that person's experiences, and there was some useful stuff in there. But in terms of it creating a theory of SLA, it wasn't useful at all. I don't think. I don't think it was meant to be.
Yeah.
So for this to work, the author needs to be one of the participants.
Well, it's written by both of the participants.
Right,
both the participants
so
are
the
the
participant
authors.
needs to be the author needs to be involved.
Yes.
needs to be. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say you could do it between two learners, but then that wouldn't be a duo-ethnography. That would just be you'd just be collecting data.
Yeah, it'd be kind of an ethnography, I guess,
Right,
but a very small scale kind of thing.
Right,
Yeah. But that'd be interesting. I mean, I guess you could expand it in that way. I mean, it would move away a little bit from the original principles, the crisis of representation, but yeah. I mean, I think it'd be interesting. So for teachers to compare their experiences of being teachers, it'd be interesting to look at in terms of motivation, perhaps looking at different people's motivations at different points. As you said, in terms of managers and different experiences with managing or assessing programs, I think there's lots of different applications. But do you think it's a valid research method?
Well, yeah. So one of the things that you said earlier is it disrupts the what was the word you used?
Dominant grand narratives.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what do you mean by this? Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, within research, especially within social theory, you end up with these big narratives, right, which describe social phenomena in very general terms. Okay. And they kind of have to do that. There was a paper I read recently called, pardon the language, it was called Fuck Nuance. And it was basically saying, when you're trying to make social theories, someone always comes along and says, yes, but what about race? Yes, but what about gender? And it becomes so that you can't make anything useful. So that's the example. That's what a grand narrative means. It means a kind of an overarching social theory. And this is to kind of say, well, so there is this, and that's valid. But then you can fill in the gaps a little bit here. You can add extra complexity in there.
So I heard somebody, can't remember who it was, but they said often when you have a research paper, the context section is very small, glossed over.
Yeah.
And the research, this leads to research getting overgeneralized. But this is very context.
It's incredibly context specific. Yeah.
So when the paper's put together, so you said it basically consists of this kind of fictionalized a version of your interaction.
Right.
Is that it, or is there commentary on that interaction?
So
included as part of the paper.
It depends what the writers want to do. What me and Marek did was we had we split it into sections. We had a little introduction to each section. We had the dialogue, and then we had a commentary at the end, and then moved on to the next section. Yeah. So that kind of summarising what we learned from that part of the interaction. But I've seen other people do it in different ways. Some people have, instead of it being a very quick back and forth, it's kind of like people monologuing at each other, and there's a lot more of the interpretation built into the dialogue. And that's also quite interesting.
And I'm sure another dimension to this is you could review this study again after 10 years. So it could take on a longitudinal kind of aspect.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. You could look back at what you talked about then and comment on that, and then update it.
Yeah.
Would it be a duo-ethnography if you were talking to yourself?
Well, that would be an autoethnography.
But in the past.
Ah, okay. That's an interesting question.
So you take what you said then and speak to it now.
I think you should do that, because I don't think that's been
seems
done.
Incredibly confusing.
It wouldn't be interactive,
It wouldn't be the same. No.
So you'd be commenting on looking at that data.
Yeah. So like you'd have to make a research journal at some point, and then decide to set it aside for like 10 years, and then come back to it. And then do that would actually be really interesting.
I think one thing that you mentioned earlier, which I think is very interesting about it, is the accessibility of it. Is the fact that I'm sure it's a lot. I know it's a lot more readable than a traditionally structured research paper. Darren Elliott, I think you pointed out to me, and I read it, recently published something in the form of a comic book.
You should say he's the guy responsible for the Lives of Teachers podcast.
Yeah, which was an excellent video interview series.
Baseball, yeah.
That was in English Language Teacher Education and Development Journal from the University of Warwick. So they had a special issue on innovative approaches to academic writing, I think. And his article was the first one, which was all about how you could present your writing in the form of a comic strip, as you say, in terms of accessibility.
Cool. What was very interesting to me was he mentioned at the end of it how time-consuming it was. That maybe it's not very practical to do it that way.
Right.
And you look at it, you think it looks like it would take less time than writing a normal paper.
So I've seen some criticism of duoethnography online and of autoethnography, and I think I think it's valid to an extent. People basically saying it's a bit self-indulgent and it's not very generalizable. And there's a possibility that you could you can kind of lie to yourself in a sense. And for me, duoethnography, the advantage duoethnography has over autoethnography is that you're in conversation with someone else, so someone else can pick you up on things if they think that you're, not exploring things critically enough. But yeah, there are criticisms out there of the method, and I think be aware that what you're doing is, if you are going to get involved in this, be aware that you're just trying to investigate and juxtapose different life histories. You're not trying to create social theory. You're not trying to create something that can be generalised to other settings. And people might take the piss out of you for it as well.
I mean, how do you think other people reading your duoethnography, what can they take from it?
I think what they can... Well, I think, first of all, it shows that there are gaps in these grand narratives. I think the main thing is that it's suggestive. It can make you go away and think about your own experiences in a new way. It might make you notice something about your own life that you didn't understand before, or that you hadn't noticed before, or about the other people around you. So again, it's not meant to be for creating social theory. It's there to help people reflect. And to kind of illustrate. It's kind of illustrative, I guess. Yeah, I mean, there are kind of pluses and minuses to doing it. I wouldn't say all research should be conducted in this way, but I think it's an interesting way of going about it, and I'd like to see more duoethnographies in applied linguistics in the future. So that's our TEFL culture for this episode, duoethnography.
Okay, so my section today is a TEFL Pioneers section, but before I get to that, I want to talk about a little bit of background, just why I'm talking about this person today. I recently attended a lecture by Gabrielle Kasper here in Tokyo, and she's going to be one of our future interviewees on the podcast, probably next month.
Okay.
She gave a talk about the self-reporting of different emotions in second language learning, and how emotion is a mediating factor in the second language acquisition process. So for example, she talked about some quantitative and qualitative research models that are available to anyone with an interest in recording participants' emotional states and changes during the process of language learning.
Okay.
She talked in detail about the potential and effectiveness of diary keeping and interviewing methods, like research interviews, in capturing the shifting interplay between emotion and learning.
Okay.
That was from a note that I took during her talk, which I quite like. For example, she talked about how interviews as a research instrument can reveal a participant's true voice, like the thing that they really want to say.
Yeah.
And a good interviewer would find that voice, give the space to explore what the interviewee, or the case, I guess, wants to say.
Yeah.
And that would reveal emotions, arguably. And also, analysing diaries have the power to reveal explicit emotions. And she's talked about if they're read beyond common sense. Do you understand that?
No.
Reading something beyond common sense.
Reading between the lines?
Yeah, like not taking it for face value.
Right.
Like doing a deeper analysis of the diaries.
Yeah.
But she used that term, beyond common sense.
Listening to the notes that aren't being played.
Right, yeah, that kind of thing, yeah. And so she also looked at some historical models that were once used, and to some extent still important today, to observe the self-reporting of emotions and the motivational processes of second language learning. One of these models was the Attitude Motivation Test Battery. Do you know who that was proposed and developed by?
No.
Simon, attitude.
Have we talked about it?
You'll probably know his name, Robert Gardner.
Oh, okay, right.
Robert Gardner. And that's who today's TEFL pioneer is.
All right.
Because in the talk, Gabrielle kind of talked about the historical importance of this battery, but she kind of said, but we're kind of beyond doing this kind of scientific testing of motivation these days, and we need to look at kind of more humanistic ways of finding out emotion and motivations.
Right.
That kind of thing. But his work is still important, so let's talk about his work.
Okay. Is he our TEFL pioneer?
He's our TEFL pioneer, yeah. Gabrielle Kasper isn't, but she will be someday. She already is a TEFL pioneer in her own right. I'm not an expert in this area of motivation, and to be honest, I find this whole area contradictive and confusing.
We should have got Richard Pinner on because he knows all about motivation.
Yeah, so he's coming out
Probably
more
best
from...
known for his Russ Main guest blog posts.
So like I was saying, I don't really like motivation. I find it... I think Rob and I tried to do a motivation study once, but then when we looked into the research, we were just like, screw this, basically. It's all been done already. And yeah. But I'm going to talk a bit about Robert Gardner's contribution to the field. So Gardner obtained his PhD under the supervision of Wallace E. Lambert.
Okay.
Who himself is a pioneer in social and cross-cultural psychology.
Right.
In 1960 he completed that, and after he completed his PhD he joined the University of Western Ontario's psychology department, where he still works today actually, so he's a living pioneer.
Okay.
In this time, throughout his career, he's known for writing two influential books, Social Psychology and Second Language Learning, The Role of Attitudes and Motivation, from 1985, and Attitudes and Motivation in Second Language Learning in 1972, and he co-authored that with Lambert.
Right.
I think his last article was maybe 2005, that's what I could find.
Right.
He was still writing about the things that he talked about in the 80s then. A lot of Gardner's work, although pivotal and vital in the field of motivational and attitudinal research, has fallen out of favour or lost its appeal with modern day researchers. And I'll come back to why I think this is later.
Right.
Although I'm not even sure if I'm correct, but I'll come back to that later anyway.
Someone will correct us if you're wrong.
Please do. So I'm going to talk a bit about his work. So Gardner comes from a social psychological tradition, prevalent until the 1990s. That, according to Zoltan Dornier, tended to see action as the function of the social context and the interpersonal, intergroup relational patterns, as measured by means of an individual's social attitudes.
Right. What does that mean?
Well, and I'll get to this later, I think he put a lot of emphasis on attitude.
Okay.
Over any other kind of ways of measuring motivation.
Right. What's the difference between attitude and motivation?
I feel that he looked more at the wider social as one big whole, rather than the minutiae of things that could affect motivation, I think. Okay.
All right.
Anyway, a lot of Gardner's theories can be found in his 1985 book, with one of his main beliefs being that a learner's attitude towards a specific language group influences how successful they will be in incorporating aspects of that language.
Okay, what does he mean by attitude towards a group?
Well, he talks about their interest, or I guess their interest in the language community.
Like a target culture?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think he attributes, if that's high, then your learning attitude is going to
But interest could cover a lot of things. Interest could cover, I don't know, how interested they are in working in that target culture, for example. Yeah. Or assimilating in many different ways.
And it could lead to disillusionment with that target culture when you've learnt enough of the language.
I think one of his main things that he said at the time in around the 70s and the 80s was that language is not socially neutral, and the act of learning or using a language is always affected by your social surroundings, which I don't think we could disagree with that these days.
No.
In Gardner's own words, second language motivation is the extent to which an individual works or strives to learn the language because of a desire to do so and the satisfaction experienced in this activity. So what I think he's saying here is that Gardner just makes a link between cognition, like a want to do something, and task enjoyment.
Right.
The affect. And that seems to be the link he made in his work.
So basically, if you like language learning and you want to learn languages, then you'll have a high motivation to learn languages. Is that a good summary so far?
I feel like with motivation, it's really easy to talk about what may motivate people, but it seems like a lot of the studies that are being done is how to properly record that, measure that, quantify that, and that's what really puts me off of looking into motivation because
it ends up feeling very circular.
In what sense circular?
Well, in that, I mean, almost like you summarized, like if somebody enjoys learning a language, they are motivated to learn that language. Like, what's the difference really?
Okay. Yeah.
Or somebody has a... Yeah, I like it captures... I guess maybe that it's useful in a term that it captures a lot of different reasons why maybe somebody pushes themselves to learn a language.
Well,
but
a lot of motivational research is focused on, I think, different models of motivation, right? Yeah. So you got your
that's another thing. How
intrinsic, extrinsic, the DMC.
Yeah. So how do you interpret motivate? Yeah. So Gardner had 3 particular areas of research. The socio-cultural model, which he came out of that tradition. His construct of the integrative motive,
right,
in which he claimed the aims of language study are to learn more about a language group, for example. And more instrumentally, this reflects the value of linguistic achievement.
Okay.
And the last one that he's known for, which I'm going to talk about more, is the attitude motivation test battery.
Right.
Which I want to focus on today because this is the one that's probably of most use. So the AMTB for short, as it's commonly referred to, was developed to measure the various components of the socio-educational model of second language acquisition and was mainly used in bilingual French-Canadian setting originally.
Okay.
The test is comprised of scales, I think Likert scales.
Right.
How much do you agree with a statement? With 11 subsets, 9 with 10 items each and 2 with 4 items. But I think this has been adapted over time and changed, but this is how Gardner describes one of the models. The conceptual variables used to test these subsets include the attitudes towards the learning situation,
right,
referring to the effective reactions to any aspect of the classroom or class learning environment. Integrativeness, taking in things like orientation, interest, and attitudes towards the language community. Motivations in terms of desire and intensity. I looked at that. Language anxiety, both in class and through language use. And then finally, instrumentality, namely the conditions where the language is being studied for practical or utilitarian purposes.
Okay. So, there's a lot of stuff there. So you've got attitude towards the learning situation, integrativeness, motivations and language anxiety and instrumentality. So is the point of this to assess people's score on each of these and figure out what thing is most motivating their attitude towards language or something like that?
So like I said, it seems very scientific and it collects quantitative data.
Right.
And I don't think it was done just with individuals. I think individuals can take it, but the whole research will just be collected as a group of learners.
And so is there an outcome in terms of they want to find a way to motivate people? Is that the idea?
Well, that's what I'd hope from studying motivation. That's what I was thinking on the way here, is what motivates people to do research in motivation in the first place. Because if it's for the good of your immediate group of learners, there's better ways to find this stuff out, like diaries or interviews.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily, I guess any kind of, it's not necessarily to find a way of doing something or improving something. Research doesn't have to be that, right? It can just be because there's something of intrinsic interest that you want to research and learn about. Like most sociological, a lot of sociological research is, it's learning about things, but you can't generalize them. So,
right, or some practical purpose may emerge later on. Right, but that's not why you're doing it necessarily.
Yeah.
But I mean, what would be interesting for this, I think, what would carry more intrinsic interest is whether or not there's any, if somebody scores high on this test, if that corresponds to more successful language learning.
Yeah.
Because if there is no correlation, then it's of some interest to know how motivated somebody is, but who cares really?
Yeah. So I think this is why some of his work has become a bit out of date and old-fashioned now.
I think the reason people are motivated to study motivation is maybe kind of instinctively, or just the feeling a lot of teachers get in the classroom is that the reason students aren't successful is because they appear not to be motivated. And so part of it is thinking, okay, how can I motivate them better? Or what kind of things would motivate them better? But it seems predicated on this belief, but I think a belief which isn't really based on anything that concrete, that it's the motivation or lack of motivation that's stopping them from doing well in the class.
Well, like I said at the beginning, emotion does underlie everything we do, even if it's not immediately observable. It is there. You can't find it, and I'm just wondering if there are different ways to find it. But I think the problem itself is in the construct of what motivation is in the first place. That's more the argument that's going on these days.
Well, I mean, like myself as a language learner, I know that to my teachers I always looked very unmotivated because I sat there and didn't speak very much and looked quite upset a lot of the time. But that was an emotional response to the fact that I was so motivated but was crap.
Yeah. And then another, again, as a language learner myself, a big part of it, people will often talk, especially people who are doing self-study, they'll say, I'm not getting anywhere because I'm not motivated enough to do it. But basically what they're saying is they're not studying.
Right.
Like you're either studying or not studying.
Right.
And if you're not studying, you can say, well, it's because I'm not motivated to study. But there's really, I don't see the distinction necessarily.
Yeah.
Somebody mentioned at the beginning. I went to a talk by Zoltan Dornier. I'm not sure if any of you were there, but
No.
okay. A couple of years back, in the talk, Dornier kind of gave us sort of a state of the arts review of like what's been done before, what's being done now, what could be done in the future, mainly what he's doing in the future, basically. Right. But what I took away from the whole presentation was this research area is too crowded. Everything's been done. There's nothing new. Go away.
What tangible results have there been in motivation? Because this is something that I've not really researched. I don't know anything about.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you. So I just find it perplexing, and it's hard to take anything away from it because it is too crowded and.
Right. It seems like we know a lot about what motivates different people at different times. Yeah. But like you were saying, it doesn't seem like there's been much application of that.
Yeah.
And it seems almost... I get the impression that research has moved towards, we're not really looking for application.
Going back to Gardner, some of the reasons why he's kind of not thought... I mean, his work's important, but people don't just use his work as a means of motivation today. From the 1990s onwards, there was a lot of counter-reactions to Gardner's work, namely a focus on certain concepts that weren't present in the social psychological approach back in the 70s and the 80s.
Right.
For example, according to Dornier, attempts were made to explore situation or task-specific motivation.
Right.
More. So it's kind of something that you mentioned before, rather than just a social whole.
Yeah.
They started to look more specifically at different contexts.
Yeah. And a one activity can be motivating, just in its design.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily say much of anything, or perhaps about the students who are doing it and what their particular motivation is to study language in general.
Right.
And it was said that Gardner's model, on the other hand, had not been elaborating on the range of possible motivational experiences, but on determining whether motivation has been aroused and specifying the learning consequences of this arousal.
Yeah. I was just thinking, it seems to me like a lot of this is almost like trying to manipulate learners.
Right.
Which I don't like.
Right.
I don't like that as a thing.
Inject some motivation into them.
Yeah. It's like I'm going to...
Well, I mean, there's two aspects. There's like... manipulating their motivation, but also manipulating the learning
environment.
It's like task-based learning looks at how can you manipulate tasks to get the best possible response.
Yeah.
I think motivation is also one of the manipulating factors as well.
Yeah.
But
I just wonder about the whole. There was a thing in ETP or MET, one of the magazines recently, and the article was fine, but the writer's biography said that he uses these experimental approaches to things. He said sometimes my students don't know if I'm. They think they're playing a game, but actually I'm assessing their... I was like, well, don't do that. I wouldn't like that.
So as I said, from like the early 1990s onwards, things started to change in the field of motivation. And this was partly Zoltan Dornier, when he came more influential, basically, things changed.
Right.
But one of the things that I saw in Zoltan Dornier's work is he sort of brings all of these models that people have done over time together. And he kind of doesn't disregard Gardner's work, but places it in a certain area of motivation research.
Right.
That
sounds like the professional way of disregarding something.
right. So he kind of puts the battery amongst other models and things like goal-related dimensions and educational context-related dimensions are now things that people more commonly talk about these days, I think. And also, like we talked about before with Dornier's direct motivational currents. That idea, looking ahead to the future, is a new area.
That's what you give someone a current if they complete a task.
You said DMZ earlier. That means demilitarized.
Oh, I said DMC.
Oh right, okay. I thought you said DMZ. I'm like, okay. Anyway, so that's
TMZ.
Threatening to put someone into the DMZ.
That's a news
website.
Yeah, it's entertainment news.
Fake news.
If you threaten to put someone in the DMZ if they don't complete a task correctly, that's quite motivating. It's quite a good extrinsic motivation.
Anyway, so this section was loosely about the work of Robert Gardner.
Thank you very much for listening.
And don't forget, if you want to get in contact with us, you can send us an email at TEFLology@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at TEFLology. If you want to listen to more episodes, you can find them at www.teflology-podcast.com. That's our home. And we'll be back soon. So it's goodbye for me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.